First story. During winter break, one night I was by myself at home. We utilize our sunroom, which doubles as a TV and movie room, as a smaller version of our living room. This is where I was watching TV. This chamber also had a door leading to the side driveway. Suddenly the lights outside come on, and I'm beneath a blanket, watching some stupid movie I can't even remember, with all the blinds closed. The motion-sensing light we have outside turned on, which was unsettling. In order to hear anything, I had to turn down the TV's volume. Though I doubted I'd hear anything from outside, I took a moment to quickly check by lifting the blinds. It was evident. Even though it was frustrating, I had to wait because I don't know how to turn off the light. I assumed that a possum, raccoon, or other animal would have set off the light, but the more I considered it, the less sense that made. In order to calm myself, I put on my shoes and took a leisurely stroll around the driveway. I could watch TV again with a clear head since no one was around. After a little while, I heard something fall outside in a bucket, and the motion-sensing light turned back on. I was worried when it happened the first time, but now I was downright afraid. There was somebody or something out there. Although I hoped it was an animal, I was beginning to have serious doubts. Since the couch was the only blind area from the side door, I was afraid that if I got up, someone would be waiting at the door. For this reason, I didn't want to get up. I wanted to turn off the TV right now, but I was hesitant to move the remote because it was in the center of the coffee table. I turned to see that the blinds were completely closed. But my eyes weren't on the blinds. Rather, they were on what I could see through them. The image of a person standing on the opposite side with their arms slightly extended from their body was perfectly rendered. I have no idea how to put into words how I was feeling at the time. I had a strong sensation in my chest and abdomen, and breathing became more difficult. That was my level of fear. I moved away from the couch as discreetly as possible, but before I could reach the door between the dining room and the sunroom, someone on the other end of the call began banging loudly on the window. I screamed in a trembling voice and called the police because I wanted to scare them away in some manner, but I was too afraid to step outside. I watched the shadow outside the blinds creep towards the door, but they didn't stop as I stood at the doorway for a moment. The woman with the brittle hair and insane elderly appearance was standing on the opposite side of the door. She began pounding on the glass of my door with both hands and yelling as if she were insane as I felt less scared of her for a little period. I slammed the sunroom door and reported an insane elderly woman trying to break into my house to the police. I was instructed to wait for the police in a secure, closed area with a firearm to defend myself, and when I heard glass breaking outside the restroom, my biggest fear of a break-in came true. After a minute of silence, I unlocked and opened the bathroom door far too slowly and softly. I glanced into my living room and saw the elderly woman with the tangle of hair standing in front of a broken window in the center of the space. She hurried over to the door after spotting me with the door open. I let out a horrified 17-year-old cry and forcefully shut the door once more. The elderly woman persisted in pounding on the door once she had started. I couldn't make out what she was saying on the other side. Beneath her breath, I was crying too much and pleading with her to leave. When there was a loud bang at the front door, I yelled, "Help!" through the bathroom window, and two police officers approached the window I was yelling through, pleading with them to climb through the broken glass out back. They told me they would be fine and would be right here. The knock on the door ceased, and there was an abrupt disturbance outside. I heard the woman beg the two police officers to move away from the door. The two police officers had the insane woman in custody when I came out of the restroom. They probably accomplished it really quickly. I averted my gaze as the woman gave me a strange expression in her eyes. It turned out that the elderly neighbor of the woman who never left the house was living with another woman. She is never truly seen by any of the neighbors. The elderly woman should have been in a special care facility because she was so dysfunctional in many areas. My parents filed charges against the younger woman because they believed that, as her purported caregiver, she ought to have been accountable for permitting a person with mental illness to enter another person's home. Although my parents were unsuccessful in their lawsuit, the insane old lady was placed in a treatment facility and was, at the very least, removed from our neighborhood. Second story. I frequently travel up to the remote area of New York, where I own a little house on a large acreage, during the winter months to go skiing. Up there is a neighbor with whom I have never once spoken. Our 2 yards are divided by a fence, and there are miles and miles of woods on the opposite sides of my property. We got to know each other since there is another neighbor across the street and farther down the road who also enjoys skiing. I had met him several times because of this. This past January, I made my first trip up for the season. I heard a child giggling not far from the neighbor's house as I approached the front door. I had no idea that they were parents. Every season was a strange first step into a house that was mostly empty for much of the year, requiring me to switch on the heat, the water, and everything else. I slept like a baby the first night, of course, after making the 4-hour drive from Connecticut. After having breakfast and getting dressed for skiing the following morning, I went outside and noticed a large red ball laying in the snow on my front lawn. I thought it belonged to the neighbors because it wasn't there the day before. After hurling the ball over the fence that divides our homes, I walked to the ski lodge to meet up with my pals, and we went skiing for the rest of the day. By the time I returned, night had fallen. I was eager to get into bed after eating dinner with my buddies. As I made my way to the front door, I saw that large red ball resting on my front lawn once more. I tossed the red ball over the fence once again, even though Howie was starting to act strange. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of children laughing outside. In the vicinity of 2 o'clock or 3 a.m., it was absurd to see kids playing outside. I left to glance outdoors, but there were no children in sight, and the laughter had ceased now. I did notice something sitting on my front lawn, though. I stepped outside in my robe and slippers to look outdoors because I couldn't tell from the window and noticed the red ball sitting in the snow once more. When I noticed it in the same location once more, I shuddered. I took the ball, and I went back to sleep inside my house instead of throwing it over the fence this time. That evening, I didn't hear anyone laughing outside again. Before heading out to ski again the following morning, I went to the neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and at last introduced myself. He was an old man who looked very innocent, which surprised me. I wondered about the ball that kept landing on my lawn and the child whose laughing I could not stop hearing. There were no children in the area, he informed me. I felt the goosebumps once more. I shook his hand, said thank you, and returned to my house. After driving back up the mountain and leaving the red ball in my living room, I went skiing with my friend one more day. I was very tired when I returned home that evening and was eager to get in the next day. I arranged everything I owned on the sofa, thinking I would organize it all the next day. My body hurt so much that I just dropped into bed and slept like a baby. But again, I woke up to the sound of children laughing outside. I bolted from the bed and went to peek out the window. Once more, the red ball was sitting in the snow. In search of the ball, I went to the living room and ripped the space apart. Even now, I am still aware that I left it in there when I departed, but it was no longer there. Suddenly, I didn't feel the house was all mine. I packed all my wet gear into my suitcase and turned on every light. To be prepared to go if the worst happened, I packed everything in a suitcase. It didn't make sense because I had double-checked to make sure all the windows and doors were locked. I went back to my room and turned off only those lights, leaving the others on. I peered out the window and saw, far behind the red ball in the snow, what appeared to be a child, standing motionless and staring directly at my window. I lowered myself and shut the shades. I shut the shades on all the windows in my home. I made every effort to simply ignore it and go to sleep. It took me a full hour before my terror gave way to tiredness and I fell asleep. The following morning, I got up, forgot to eat breakfast, packed up the car, and drove away, never turning around to see the red ball that was still sitting on my front lawn. I felt comfortable leaving it in that position since I've never had anything in that house that may be stolen. That child's laughing still haunts me, and I'm not sure how whoever was out there got into my house to take the ball out in the first place. The sight of that child standing outdoors in the freezing snow in the middle of the night was the most terrifying aspect of the entire ordeal. Though, this whole situation would have been different if that ball hadn't been removed from my living room in some way. But I'm not sure what to think about that. Third story. George, my roommate, and I connected over our jobs. We commute in a group of 15 minutes each way to and from work each day. To start with, we recently acquired a new neighbor. Actually, that was 2 weeks ago. He wasn't even unpacking when we watched. We were never even privy to his appearance. We had no idea how many people had moved in or even if he was a man or a woman. However, I say he because it's evident that we finally found out. George and I actually went to the next door to introduce ourselves on the third day, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway, he was at home. We reasoned that he might not have been able to respond for whatever reason. George stopped me as we were returning down the driveway and muttered to me to look at the window beside the front entrance. A kink in the blinds caught my eye. Like a creep, a man was holding it up and peering through it. George and I exchanged a look and continued walking, agreeing that it was incredibly uncomfortable and unsettling. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning that night that I suddenly began to hear sounds coming from outside. We constantly have the windows open because our home is always warm. The sound was coming from the neighbor's backyard, which is kind of overlooked by my upper room. When I stepped outside to take a look, the neighbor was there. He was a large-built man sawing a large piece of wood while sporting an oddly hooded hoodie in the midst of an unusually warm 72-degree day. It was an absurd scene. I headed over to George's door to knock. It seemed that the sound had also roused him to consciousness. The guy was doing something insane at this hour, and it continued for a while, and he had work early the next morning. We decided to approach him and request that he stop since he was outside. We didn't knock on the door, we pounded on the gate. The saw stopped as we did. The gate never opened, despite his expectation that it would any moment. But at least the saw stopped, and we resumed our sleep. We didn't hear any noises in the middle of the night again until a few nights later. I couldn't immediately identify the sounds when I woke up. Not until I understood the sounds were screaming and reached the window. There seemed to be screaming coming from the next-door residence. And once more, I noticed the neighbor outside in his backyard. He was carrying something while running into his home. It was unclear to me what. Then he came to a stop, turned to face my window, and stepped away from it. I realized and sprinted to George's door. He had also been awakened by the sounds. He immediately reported this to the police over the phone. As I was listening while standing just in front of his door, I heard someone bang from downstairs. It was the door to her back. We exchanged terrified glances with one another. The man had just come into our house while George was still on the phone with the police, so he yelled into the phone to send help. I moved to the stairs and then the hallway. I listened and peered down the steps. A creaking sound was audible. The planks beneath that. I carefully returned to George's room and closed the door. He hung up after telling the woman on the line to have the cops enter via the back to us right away. His door is unlocked, so we pressed up against it in case the man attempted to open it. God forbid. The bathroom door opened as I heard footsteps coming up the stairs quickly, but George and I hurried to George's door. We started to exert as much force as we could. The man attempted to force the door open by pushing, pounding, and striking it with a blunt object. For precisely that reason, we made no attempt to surpass him. We had no idea what kind of weaponry he might possess. He was unable to force through the door, though, no matter what he did. When we heard him head downstairs, everything was silent. After a few minutes, we made the decision to open the door and take a quick look outdoors. It wasn't him in the corridor. Abruptly, we heard a man's loud, authoritative voice yell, "Police!" When George and I made it downstairs, we were relieved. There were no police in sight, but I quickly discovered that there was someone hidden behind our dining room table. The man behind the table jumped up and chased us up the stairs when I instructed George to run back upstairs with me. We headed to the bathroom this time so we could at least lock the door, but we didn't stay there for very long since downstairs we heard someone yelling "Police" again, and this time it was true. There was silence upstairs as the man who had been hammering on the door stopped. When George and I yelled, "Up here! Up here!" the two policemen came charging up the stairs and told the man to put down his gun. When the cops ordered us to leave, we did so after hearing the sound of a knife being dropped on the ground. He was led in handcuffs to the police vehicle and placed in the rear seat. We heard screaming, so we asked the police to search his house. 2 minutes later, 2 additional police cars showed up in front of our house, and they entered with their rifles drawn. We watched in dismay as the police emerged from the house carrying a woman who was sobbing uncontrollably. She was screaming as loudly as she could, pushing up against the door of his sealed basement. The man had been dragging a bag around the backyard, and inside was a dead person. Although the identity of the deceased body and the woman were not fully revealed to us, we can assume that the man was sentenced to life in prison. The house is once again available for rent. All we can hope for is that a normal person moves in.